I was enjoying my morning coffee on my back deck, watching the sun rise over Clearwater Lake, when my phone buzzed with an email notification. I almost ignored it. Saturday mornings were sacred in my book. But the subject line caught my attention. Notice of property development, Clearwater Shores Project. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My brow furrowed as I opened the email. It was from Lakeside Developers LLC, informing area residents about an exciting new luxury condominium project breaking ground next month on the eastern shore of Clearwater Lake. My eastern shore of Clearwater Lake. This has to be a mistake, I muttered, scrolling through the email with growing alarm. There was a PDF attachment, a detailed site plan showing a massive 5-story complex with a private marina jutting out into the water. The very water that had been part of my property since my grandfather built this house 40 years ago. I immediately called the number listed in the email. After navigating an irritating automated system, I finally reached a representative. "I'm looking at plans for a development on land that I own," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There must be some misunderstanding. "Sir, Lakeside Developers has acquired all necessary permits and land rights for the Clearwater Shores Project," the representative responded in a practiced tone. "The purchase was finalized through the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association last month." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "That's impossible. The HOA doesn't have the authority to sell my lake rights." "According to our documentation, sir, they do. Perhaps you should speak with your HOA representative. Have a nice day." The call ended before I could respond. I sat there, stunned, as reality sank in. The HOA had somehow sold my lake rights without my knowledge or consent. This couldn't be legal. I immediately pulled up the HOA bylaws on my computer, combing through every page. After an hour of searching, I found nothing that gave them the authority to sell any part of my property. But then I remembered something that made my blood run cold. 6 months ago, there had been a routine update to the HOA covenants that Patricia Westfield, our power-hungry HOA president, had assured. Everyone was just standard legal housekeeping. I'd signed off on it without reading the fine print. So had most of my neighbors. Patricia Westfield, just the thought of her made my jaw clench. She'd taken over as HOA president 3 years ago and had been making everyone's life miserable ever since. From issuing citations for grass, half an inch too tall, to demanding approval for every holiday decoration, Patricia ruled Pinewood Estates like her personal fiefdom. I grabbed my phone and snapped pictures of the email and development plans, then headed straight to my home office to dig through my files. I needed to find that covenant update, and I needed to find out exactly what I'd agreed to. 2 hours, and a massive paper pile later, I found it. Buried in the dense legal text was a new clause giving the HOA board the right to manage and allocate common water resources for the benefit of the community. It was vague enough to sound harmless, but with the right lawyer, I realized they could interpret it as authority to sell lake access. But there was something Patricia and her developer friends didn't know, something my grandfather had told me when he left me this property, something that wasn't in any public record. I owned the dam, not just any dam, the small but critical control structure that regulated Clearwater Lake's water level. It sat on a remote corner of my property, hidden by trees and accessed by a private road. My grandfather had built it in the 1970s, when he and other original homeowners created the lake by damming Clearwater Creek. While the lake itself became a shared resource, the actual dam structure and the land it sat on had remained private property. My property. I allowed myself a small smile. This might be the leverage I needed. But first I needed evidence. I drove to the county records office and spent the rest of the day requesting documents. The original property surveys, my deed, the lake formation. Agreements and any recent transactions between the HOA and Lakeside Developers. What I found confirmed my suspicions. The HOA had sold exclusive development rights to the eastern shoreline for $2, $3 million my shoreline, and there was Patricia's signature on every page, along with that of Michael Reynolds, the HOA treasurer who always backed her play. I considered calling a lawyer immediately, but decided on a different approach first. I wanted to give Patricia the chance to explain herself and possibly dig her own grave deeper. The next morning, I walked across the neighborhood to Patricia's immaculately landscaped colonial. Her Mercedes and her husband's BMW sat in the driveway, gleaming in the morning sun. I rang the doorbell and waited, trying to keep my expression neutral. Patricia opened the door, her blonde bob perfectly styled despite the early hour. Her smile faltered when she saw me. "James," she said, recovering quickly. "What brings you by so early on a Sunday?" "I think you know, Patricia," I replied calmly. "The Clearwater Shores Project? The one being built on my property?" She laughed dismissively. "Oh, that! Well, it's not exactly your property, James. The lake frontage is community property, according to the updated covenants." "Updated covenants that you deliberately obscured," I said, holding up printouts of the documents I'd found. "You sold my lake rights without my knowledge." Patricia's smile tightened. "The board acted within its authority. The sale benefits everyone. Property values will increase substantially with a luxury development next door." "I want the deal cancelled," I said firmly. "You had no right." Her demeanor changed instantly, eyes narrowing. "The deal is done, James. The papers are signed, permits approved, and frankly, your opposition will only make things difficult for you. The community has moved forward." "We'll see about that," I said, turning to leave. "One more thing," she called after me. "The developers begin preliminary work tomorrow. Any interference will be considered trespassing. I'd hate to have to call the sheriff on a neighbor." I walked away, my mind racing. Patricia clearly had no intention of backing down. And worse, work was starting tomorrow. I needed to act quickly. When I got home, I found an official letter from the HOA in my mailbox. It was a notice of violation for unapproved landscaping modifications, citing the native wildflower garden I'd planted last spring, which Patricia had complimented just weeks ago. The fine was $500, due immediately. This wasn't just about the lake anymore. This was war. I spent Sunday afternoon making calls, first to Mark Thompson, a retired attorney who lived at the north end of the lake and had never gotten along with Patricia. Then to the Johnsons, the Garcias, the Patels, and half a dozen other neighbors who had faced Patricia's petty tyranny over the years. By evening, my living room was filled with concerned homeowners, all sharing similar stories of Patricia's overreach and manipulation. Sarah Garcia had brought copies of the HOA financial records. As association secretary, she had access to documents that showed something shocking. There was no record of where the $2, $3 million had gone. It wasn't in any HOA account. "This isn't just unethical," Mark Thompson said, reviewing the papers. "It's likely criminal, but we need more evidence before we can take action." "What about stopping the development in the meantime?" asked David Johnson. "Once they break ground, it'll be harder to fight." That's when I decided to share my ace in the hole. "There's something you all should know," I said. "My grandfather left me more than just a lakefront property. I own the dam that creates Clearwater Lake." The room fell silent as I explained the history and showed them the original deed. "So you control the lake's water level?" Sarah asked, eyes widening with understanding. "Exactly," I replied, "and without water, there's no lakefront development." A plan quickly formed. We would take a three-pronged approach: legal, public, and practical. Mark would file an emergency injunction against the development. Sarah would expose the missing funds at the next town council meeting. and I would use my control of the dam as leverage, if needed. Early Monday morning, I drove out to the dam. It was a simple concrete structure with manual controls. Nothing fancy, but crucial to maintaining Clearwater Lake. I took detailed photos of the structure and the property markers proving it was on my land, then performed a careful inspection to make sure everything was in working order. As I was finishing, a construction truck drove up to the eastern shore, followed by several workers in hard hats. Preliminary work was starting, just as Patricia had warned. I returned home to find another HOA violation notice, this time for unauthorized vehicles, because my work truck was parked in my driveway rather than the garage. Another $500 fine. That afternoon, Mark filed the emergency injunction. Sarah scheduled a presentation at the town council for the following week, and I prepared a careful document detailing my ownership of the dam, my legal rights, and the potential consequences if the development proceeded. Tuesday morning, I hand-delivered copies of this document to Lakeside Developers, the county permit office, and Patricia's house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I also attached a detailed engineering assessment explaining how lowering the lake by just 2 feet would leave the planned marina sitting in mud. By noon, my phone was ringing. It was Victor Reyes, the CEO of Lakeside Developers. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I've received your interesting documentation regarding the Clearwater Lake Dam." "All factually accurate," I replied. "Perhaps we should meet to discuss this situation. There seems to be some confusion about the property rights involved." We arranged to meet at my house that afternoon. When Victor arrived, I was surprised to see Patricia with him, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "Patricia insisted on joining us," Victor explained, as they sat in my living room. "She assures me this is all a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I said, laying out copies of all my documentation on the coffee table. "I own the dam. Without it, Clearwater Lake doesn't exist, and I'm prepared to lower the water level if this development proceeds." Victor examined the papers carefully while Patricia fumed. "This is blackmail," she snapped. "You can't just drain a lake because you don't like progress." "Actually, I can," I replied calmly. "It's my property right. Just like the eastern shore was mine before you illegally sold it." Victor looked up from the papers, his expression serious. "These appear legitimate, Patricia. You assured me all necessary rights had been secured." Patricia's face flushed. "They were. The HOA has authority." "The HOA never had authority to sell my lake rights," I interrupted. "And there's another issue we need to discuss, Victor. The $2.3 million your company paid. It never reached the HOA accounts. Would you like to tell me where that money went, Patricia?" The color drained from her face. Victor's eyes narrowed as he turned to her. "That's absurd," she stammered. "The funds were allocated to community improvements, future projects." "We have the financial records," I said. "There's no record of the payment in any HOA account." Victor stood abruptly. "I think we need to pause this project until these matters are clarified. My company won't be involved in anything illegal." Patricia jumped to her feet. "You can't back out now. We have a contract." "A contract that may be void if you misrepresented your authority," Victor replied coldly. "My legal team will be reviewing everything immediately." After they left, Victor professionally, Patricia without another word, I felt the first real hope that this might be resolved. But I knew Patricia wouldn't give up easily. Sure enough, the next day, a certified letter arrived from a law firm representing the HOA, threatening to sue me for tortious interference and defamation. It was a desperate move, but still concerning. Mark Thompson reviewed the letter and laughed. They have no case, but this shows they're scared. That evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called. I arrived to find the community center packed with homeowners, many of whom had never attended a meeting before. Patricia stood at the front, attempting to maintain control as angry residents demanded answers about the lake development. The board acted within its authority for the benefit of all residents, she insisted, her voice rising over the murmurs of dissent. Property values will increase significantly. What about the $2.3 million? Sarah Garcia called out. Where is that money, Patricia? The room erupted as Patricia tried to deflect. Those funds are allocated for future community projects. This is not the time or place. Actually, it's exactly the right time and place, I said, standing. As homeowners, we have a right to know where our money goes. And as someone whose property rights were violated, I have a right to answers. For the next hour, residents voiced their concerns and anger. Michael Reynolds, the treasurer, looked increasingly uncomfortable as financial questions mounted. Finally, he stood up. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice shaking. Patricia told me the board had unanimous approval for the land sale. She said the money would be transferred to the HOA accounts after some legal issues were resolved. I signed the papers based on her assurances. All eyes turned to Patricia, who stared daggers at Michael. This meeting is adjourned, she announced, gathering her papers. No, it's not, said Mark Thompson, rising. I move for an immediate vote to remove Patricia Westfield from the HOA board for ethical violations and potential misappropriation of funds. The motion passed 43-2. Patricia and her husband were the only dissenting votes. The following week was a whirlwind. Victor Reyes announced that Lakeside Developers was withdrawing from the project and cooperating with an investigation into the property sale. The county permit office suspended all development approvals pending resolution of the ownership dispute. And most satisfyingly, Patricia Westfield received a visit from 2 detectives investigating the missing $3 million. It took 3 months for everything to be resolved legally. The lake rights were restored to their rightful owners. The development project was permanently cancelled, and Patricia and Michael both faced charges for fraud and embezzlement. Patricia and her husband listed their house for sale before her case even went to trial. The moving trucks arrived on a rainy Tuesday, and I watched from my deck as they loaded up the Westfields' belongings. Patricia never looked my way as she climbed into her Mercedes for the last time. That evening, I hosted a lakeside barbecue for all the neighbors who had stood together against the development. As the sun set over the calm waters of Clearwater Lake, Mark Thompson raised a toast. To James, he said, who reminded us all that sometimes the most powerful thing isn't money or influence, it's simply knowing what you truly own. I smiled, looking out over the peaceful lake that my grandfather had helped create. Patricia had never bothered to research the history of the community she'd tried to control. She'd never known that the quiet homeowner with the wildflower garden and occasionally visible work truck held the literal power to pull the plug on her schemes. Sometimes, justice comes from the most unexpected places, or in this case, from a small concrete dam hidden in the woods and the deed that proved it was mine. 6 months after Patricia's departure from Pinewood Estates, life had returned to a peaceful rhythm. The new HOA board, led by Sarah Garcia, focused on actual community improvements rather than power trips and vindictive enforcement. My wildflower garden flourished without any citation notices, and neighbors waved as they passed by my work truck parked in the driveway. It was during this period of calm that I received an unexpected visitor on a crisp autumn morning. I was raking leaves when a luxury sedan I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, looking somewhat uncomfortable as he approached. "James Mitchell?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Edward Westfield, Patricia's husband." I hesitated before shaking his hand, surprised to see him back in the neighborhood after everything that had happened. "What brings you here, Edward?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral despite my wariness. He sighed, hands in his pockets as he looked out toward the lake. "I came to return something and perhaps to clear my conscience." From his jacket, he pulled out a USB drive. "This contains all of Patricia's files regarding the development deal and other HOA matters, things you should know." I accepted the drive cautiously. "Why give this to me now?" Edward looked genuinely regretful. I was blind to what was happening for too long. When Patricia was arrested last month for similar schemes in our new community, I finally had to face the truth about who she is. He paused, struggling with his next words. "The plea deal she's negotiating doesn't include what happened here. I thought you deserved to know everything." After Edward left, I immediately called Mark Thompson and Sarah Garcia. Within an hour, we were huddled around my kitchen table, examining the contents of the USB drive. What we found was far worse than we had imagined. Patricia had been running a sophisticated scheme for years, not just months. The files contained meticulous records of every violation fine she had engineered, most for infractions she had completely fabricated. There were spreadsheets tracking which homeowners were most vulnerable to intimidation, which board members could be manipulated, and which properties she had targeted for acquisition through various pressure tactics. Most disturbing were the emails between Patricia and Victor Reyes that predated the official development announcement by nearly 2 years. They had been planning the lake development since shortly after Patricia became HOA president. The $3 million was just the first payment in a profit-sharing arrangement that would have earned Patricia over $10 million if the project had been completed. "She wasn't just corrupt," Sarah whispered, scrolling through the emails. "She was methodical. This was her business model." Mark nodded grimly. "And she almost got away with it. If you hadn't owned that dam, James." I sat back in my chair, a realization dawning. That's why she targeted me specifically with those violation notices. "Look at this." I pointed to a folder labeled Priority Removals. Inside was a dossier on me and 5 other homeowners whose properties were crucial to the development plans. Patricia had detailed strategies for forcing each of us out, from harassment via violation notices to manipulating property values, and even plans to approach us with lowball buyout offers during manufactured financial hardships. The next day, we took everything to District Attorney Sofia Menendez, who had been handling Patricia's embezzlement case. Her eyes widened as we presented the new evidence. "This changes everything," she said, reviewing the files. "We're no longer talking about simple embezzlement. This is organized fraud, conspiracy, possibly even racketeering." In the following weeks, the case against Patricia expanded dramatically. Additional charges were filed, and several former business associates came forward with similar stories from other communities. Victor Reyes faced charges of his own, though he immediately began negotiating to testify against Patricia in exchange for leniency. The revelation that shocked me most came during a private meeting with DA Menendez. "We've been tracking Patricia's activities back several years," she explained, "and discovered something you should know. Your grandfather's property, specifically the dam, was targeted from the beginning." She showed me emails from 10 years earlier when Patricia had just moved to the area. She had researched all the properties around the lake, identified the dam as the key control point, and even consulted with attorneys about how to gain control of it legally. When those avenues failed, she had orchestrated her rise to HOA president specifically to find another way. Your grandfather refused to sell to 3 different front companies before he passed away, Menendez explained. Patricia was playing a very long game here. I drove out to the dam that afternoon, seeing it with new eyes. The simple concrete structure my grandfather had built had been at the center of a decade-long scheme. I remembered his warnings to never sell the property, to be wary of anyone showing too much interest in the dam. He had known someone was after it but couldn't prove who. Now I understood why he had been so insistent about keeping the dam's ownership private, documenting it thoroughly, but quietly. He hadn't just left me a piece of property, he had entrusted me with protection of the entire community. As I stood there, watching the water flow through the controlled spillway, another realization struck me. Patricia hadn't just failed because I owned the dam. She had failed because she fundamentally misunderstood what gave the property its value. To her, the lake was just a commodity to be exploited, waterfront views to be sold at premium prices. She never appreciated that the lake's true value came from the community that had formed around it, the shared resource that benefited everyone. My grandfather had understood this when he helped build the dam decades ago. It wasn't about control, it was about stewardship. The criminal proceedings against Patricia, Michael, and Victor continued through the winter and into spring. With each new revelation, more victims from other communities came forward. Patricia had apparently been running similar schemes in 3 different states over 15 years. What happened at Pinewood Estates wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the first time she had failed. Meanwhile, our community began the process of healing and rebuilding. The new HOA board, with unanimous support from residents, established a legal trust to protect the lake and surrounding natural areas from future development. I contributed the dam to this trust, with specific provisions ensuring it would always be managed for the benefit of all residents. Sarah organized a community history project documenting the lake's creation and the contributions of original homeowners like my grandfather. Mark Thompson led the effort to rewrite the HOA covenants, removing the loopholes Patricia had exploited and adding extraordinary transparency requirements for all financial and property decisions. What struck me most during this period was how the crisis had transformed us from a collection of individual homeowners into a genuine community. People who had barely spoken beyond casual waves at the mailbox were now working together on shared projects, having cookouts, helping each other with repairs and improvements. The threat Patricia had posed had revealed something valuable, the power of collective action and mutual support. 1 year to the day after I first discovered the development plan, we held a celebration at the community center. The case against Patricia had concluded with a 15-year sentence and millions in restitution payments to various communities she had defrauded. Victor Reyes had received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony, and Michael Reynolds had been given probation for his cooperation. More importantly, our neighborhood had transformed. The money recovered from Patricia's accounts had funded new walking trails around the lake, restoration of natural habitats along the shoreline, and a small playground near the community center. As I looked around at my neighbors enjoying the celebration, I spotted David Johnson, one of the quieter residents who had joined our initial resistance against Patricia. "Can I ask you something, James?" he said, joining me by the punch bowl. "What would you have actually done if they had? Ignored your ownership of the dam? Would you really have drained the lake?" I smiled, considering the question seriously. "Honestly, I'm not sure. It was a powerful threat, but actually following through would have hurt everyone, not just Patricia and the developers. I'd like to think I would have found another way." David nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Patricia's biggest mistake wasn't just failing to research the dam's ownership, it was believing that power comes from controlling resources rather than building community. He gestured toward the gathering. Look at what we've created here. That's real power. People working together because they want to, not because they're forced to. His words resonated with something I'd been feeling, but couldn't articulate. Patricia had approached everything as a zero-sum game. For her, to win, others had to lose. She accumulated power by making others feel powerless. But our community had found strength in a completely different approach, sharing resources, distributing authority, working toward common goals. My grandfather had understood this intuitively. The dam was never meant to be a source of control, but a shared resource that benefited everyone. As the sun set over Clearwater Lake, casting golden reflections across the water, I realized the most powerful lesson from the entire ordeal. True security doesn't come from controlling resources or enforcing rules. It comes from being part of something larger than yourself, a community where people look out for each other and work toward collective well-being. Patricia had built her life around accumulating power over others and ultimately lost everything. We had built something together that was far stronger than any single person could create alone. The lake would remain, the community would thrive, and the dam would continue to serve its purpose, not as a threat or a source of leverage, but as the foundation for something beautiful we all shared. The final chapter in Patricia's story came unexpectedly, nearly 2 years after she began serving her sentence. I received a letter from her attorney offering to transfer ownership of her former property at a substantially reduced price. My client wishes to make amends, the attorney explained when I called to verify the offer was legitimate. She has had time to reflect on her actions and understands the damage she caused. I was skeptical, of course. Patricia had never shown remorse during her trial, maintaining that she was simply an aggressive businesswoman being punished for her success. But after consulting with Mark and reviewing the offer carefully, I discovered the property transfer included something fascinating. Water rights Patricia had quietly acquired on the opposite side of the lake, rights that could have been used for another development project if she had succeeded with the first one. By purchasing her property, I would secure the final piece needed to protect the entire lakefront from future development attempts. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia's scheme had ultimately led to the permanent protection of the very resource she had tried to exploit. I used a portion of my settlement from the civil suit against her to purchase the property, which I immediately transferred to the community trust. At the next HOA meeting, when I explained what had happened, Sarah suggested something unexpected, converting Patricia's former house into a community center and nature education facility. It would be a fitting transformation, she said, from a base of operations for greed to a resource everyone can enjoy. The day we opened the new nature center, I found myself standing on the back deck of Patricia's former home, looking out. Over the lake, the garden had been replanted with native species, the imposing privacy fence replaced with a welcoming pathway leading down to the water. Inside, displays told the story of Clearwater Lake, its creation, the wildlife it supported, and the community that had come together to protect it. There was even a small exhibit about the dam, explaining its purpose and history. I had insisted, however, that we include nothing about Patricia or the development scheme. This place wasn't about the conflict, it was about what we had built. After the conflict ended, as families explored the new center, I walked down to the shoreline. The water lapped gently against the natural rock barrier we had installed to prevent erosion, a stark contrast to the concrete marina the developers had planned. A blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, watching for fish, undisturbed by the children pointing excitedly from the observation deck. This was what victory really looked like. Not Patricia's downfall, satisfying though that had been, but the thriving ecosystem and community that had been preserved. My grandfather would have been proud. He had built the dam, not as a means of control, but as a foundation for something meaningful that outlived him. In my own way, I had continued his legacy, not by wielding power over the water, but by ensuring it remained a shared blessing for generations to come. As I looked across the sparkling surface of Clearwater Lake, I realized that some victories aren't measured by what you prevent, but by what you protect. Not by who loses, but by what endures. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right. On your screen, if this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.